It's no secret to anyone that the great gatherer of Russian lands and his Chekist mafia cronies sincerely consider Ukraine to be a failed state, or simply a mistake on the political map of the world. A temporary mistake, of course. The so-called Z-patriots, as well as the millions who have been brainwashed by propaganda and endless poverty, are in full solidarity with the Kremlin's elite. But here's the catch. After all, in his scandalous pseudo-historical article, Putin directly claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. Then it turns into some kind of absurdity. It turns out that all these years, Russians have been fighting against themselves. So how do you explain such nonsense to the poorly educated lumpen proletariat? And not just to them. That's why today's video will be dedicated exclusively to how exactly the master of all Muscovy and his loyal lackeys explain the necessity of war. Let's look at all the options that Russian propaganda has been presenting for the last 4 years, and of course I will prove their complete baselessness. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Shatov channel. I will specifically strike at the most sensitive and painful spots of the Kremlin's well-fed liars. Let's get down to business. Where were you for 8 years when Donbas was being bombed? Donbas. Actually, over the past 4 years of the full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, the ruling Moscow regime and Tsar Vladimir Tavrichesky himself have given many explanations as to why the decision was made to start the so-called special military operation. However, none of them seem even remotely close to the truth. Instead, they sound more like blatant nonsense that only someone who doesn't know how to use their brain could believe. But then again, what did we expect from an ordinary Russian guy? So, the main one. The most frequently mentioned reason for the invasion was that Russia launched the special operation to end the 8-year-long war in Donbas and the suffering of the local population in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It's actually hard to comment on this at all because of how blatantly absurd it is. Donbas is actually the region that has suffered the most from the full-scale war that began on February 24, 2022. Accordingly, the number of casualties and the scale of destruction over the next 4 years can't even be compared to what happened from 2014 to 2022. Moreover, since the signing of the Minsk agreements in February 2015, the intensity of hostilities had been steadily decreasing, even despite constant violations by pro-Russian militants. The number of casualties was constantly decreasing, and most of those killed were actually civilians who were either caught in shelling or hit a mine or tripwire somewhere in a grove. Yes, of course, life in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics was far from easy, but it was more because of their unrecognized status and blatant betrayal by the Russian authorities, who constantly promised their puppets the world, but in reality gave them only crumbs, rather than because of the ongoing hybrid war. As a result, the occupied part of Donbas became not a showcase of the Russian world, but a real disgrace to it. Later on, the Kremlin's propagandists started pushing this narrative, claiming that the so-called Kiev junta was preparing to launch an offensive in the spring of 2022, and Russia was forced to deliver a preemptive strike. The argument is actually just as absurd as the previous one. If only because over the past 4 years, Moscow has not provided any credible evidence that the Ukrainian authorities were preparing to launch an offensive against the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And as for the sharp escalation of the situation that began in Donbas on February 17, 2022, even an untrained eye can see that it was artificially engineered.
Со стороны РФ. Такой себе прелюдию к началу полномасштабного вторжения.
Промоделируем от противного. That's not even the main point. Let's suppose that the Ukrainian army really was planning, as Moscow claims, an offensive against the DPR and LPR in the spring of 2022. And Putin would have intervened militarily, coming to the aid of his cronies. What consequences would that have had? How would the war have developed then? Completely differently. First of all, Europe's reaction would have been completely different. From 2015 to February 2022, France and Germany repeatedly stated publicly that the use of force in Donbas was unacceptable. If Zelensky had suddenly attacked Donbas, people would view him the same way they now view Putin, like toward a mad tyrant who had been told many times not to start a war, but still went ahead and started it. Of course, no one would have called Zelensky that directly. Perhaps there would have been some statements condemning the Kremlin's policy. But in reality, the European Union would not have imposed even a tenth of the sanctions against Russia that have been imposed now. Perhaps the United States would have had a slightly different attitude toward what was happening, but it's unlikely that President Biden would have been able to completely ignore the position of the most important European allies. And certainly, no one would have supplied Ukraine with heavy weapons and ammunition for them. Instead, Europe would have constantly demanded that Ukraine sit down at the negotiating table. The reaction of France and Germany would have been about the same as it was to Russia's actions in 2014. Remember what the strategic position of François Hollande and Angela Merkel was back then. Yes, Putin is a jerk. Yes, he violated the world order by annexing Crimea and starting the war in Donbas, but still, it is necessary to negotiate with Putin, not to keep fighting. Maybe Ukraine would have been fully supported by the United Kingdom, Poland and the Baltic states, though even that isn't certain, but their help would hardly have made a big difference. Such an option would have directly impacted hostilities. Ukraine's ammunition might have quickly run out without large Western supplies, especially Soviet 152 mini artillery shells. Yes, and the Russian army, whose forces turned out to be insufficient to capture all of Ukraine, would most likely have managed at least to repel the Ukrainian armed forces' offensive in Donbas if they had concentrated their efforts there. In that case, civilian casualties in Donbas certainly wouldn't have been higher and likely would have been much lower than now. Support for the military actions would have been very different, both internationally and within Ukraine. According to surveys, after 2015, only a small minority of the country's population supported a military scenario for returning Donbas to Ukrainian control. An offensive under those conditions would have been a reckless gamble and a disaster for Zelensky and his team, which Kyiv fully understood. Therefore, no preparations were made for any offensives, neither in 2022 nor in any other year. Indeed, the Ukrainian authorities did not want to implement the Minsk agreement and its political provisions granting broad autonomy to Donbas. But that does not mean at all that it was preparing for an offensive. Its position, both under Poroshenko and under Zelensky, could be formulated as follows. First, hand over control of the border and then everything else. We don't need the occupied territories in any other form. Military scenarios, if they were considered at all, were only done with absolute assurance that Russia would not intervene directly, as in the Ilovaisk case. But that was definitely not the situation at the beginning of 2022, when a 200,000-strong Russian army was standing at Ukraine's borders. And the world media were constantly reporting about the imminent invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, if Putin really had information from somewhere about the preparation for an offensive by the armed forces of Ukraine, the only logical action would have been to wait for the start of that very offensive, so that Kyiv would expose itself in front of the whole world, and only after that deliver a counterstrike. After all, 99% of all Russia's problems with the West came afterward, and because Putin started the war on February 24 without any justified reason. This fact was clearly perceived by Europeans and Americans as unprovoked aggression, and thus deprived all the numerous lobbyists for Russia in the West of any arguments in its defense. And once again, the bloodthirsty NATO. By the way, in Putin's address on the morning of February 24, 2022, there was no specific emphasis at all that it was meant to prevent an offensive by the Ukrainian armed forces. It was only stated in general terms that the Ukrainian authorities had completely refused a peaceful settlement of the conflict, and that a clash between Russia and Ukrainian nationalists was inevitable. They're preparing, not just waiting for the right moment. There was also a phrase saying that supposedly Russia would not repeat the mistake of June 22, 1941. In other words, it would not wait to be attacked, but would strike first. But even here, it was clear from the context that this referred not to the armed forces of Ukraine and Donbas, but to NATO's eastward expansion. So we come back again to the notorious topic, which we have a separate video about on our channel. I recommend everyone watch it, either as a supplement to this video or as a standalone spin-off. One thing is clear, while the Kremlin feeds its domestic audience the tale about the need to protect the people of Donbas from the damned Ukrainian Nazis, for the more sophisticated West, they've prepared nonsense for the general public about the dangers of NATO's eastward expansion. And that's despite the fact that up until the full-scale invasion, NATO wasn't really expanding eastward, at least not in recent years, but Russia, on the other hand, was expanding only to the west. The residents of Crimea can definitely confirm that. Let me emphasize once again that NATO was the main focus in Putin's speech on the morning of February 24. At that time, he wasn't addressing Ukraine, which he attacked, but rather the hated West. According to the gatherer of Russian lands, the declining West made Ukraine into anti-Russia. They were preparing to accept it into NATO, so that later they could use Ukraine itself to start a war against the Russian Federation. The West, they say, ignored Moscow's constant calls to build a new security architecture in Europe by turning Ukraine into a neutral state. That is why poor and rejected Mother Russia was forced, with a heavy heart, to start the special operation in order to eliminate the potential threat posed by the neo-Nazis entrenched in Kiev. What can be said here? At the very least, that by the beginning of February 2022, there was no situation where Ukraine was on the verge of joining NATO. In fact, the West did everything to show they didn't want Ukraine there. And even Boris Johnson, who was radically anti-Russian, openly stated just a couple of weeks before the invasion that Ukraine would not join NATO in the foreseeable future. And Biden never promised Kiev full membership either. But that's only half the problem. The completely absurd theory that the North Atlantic Alliance was actually preparing to attack Russia would not stand up to practical scrutiny during the current war. If NATO had such a desire, now would be the best time to act on it. Almost the entire Russian army is engaged in Ukraine, and NATO could practically take Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, or Murmansk with bare hands. But NATO is not attacking Russia. Yes, the alliance supplies weapons to Ukraine, but it doesn't send its own soldiers there to fight. And why is that? The reason is obvious. Moscow has nuclear weapons, and there is a strong unwillingness to start a third world war. And it's even harder to imagine that NATO would want to attack Russia in a situation where there was no major war in Ukraine. Western elites, of course, didn't like the Russian government even before the war, wanted to see it replaced, and strategically perhaps wanted to weaken Putin's Russia as a potential threat. But in their arsenal for achieving this goal, they had all sorts of means, destabilizing the situation inside the country, dragging Moscow into military conflicts with third countries, sanctions, and so on. Except for one thing, a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. At least as long as the Russian Federation has a powerful nuclear arsenal and missile carriers, none of which can be shot down by any air defense system in the world.
Борец за мировую справедливость.
The next version can be classified as intellectual. It is very rarely mentioned by propagandists because it is too complicated for average Russians to understand. But this version is personally favored by Putin, although he doesn't mention it often. Its most famous performance was on September 30, 2022, when the official announcement was made about the annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions. At that time, the Orthodox Tsar solemnly delivered another batch of nonsense in the St. George Hall of the Kremlin, blaming the collective West for all the sins. According to the twisted mind of the Russian Führer, he attacked Ukraine because, and now, pay attention, because by doing so, he is fighting against globalism and an unjust international order. And the war in Ukraine is just the beginning of some kind of world revolution against the hegemony of the West and the so-called Golden Billion, while at the same time accusing the US of treating the whole world as their backyard where they can do whatever they want. That is why the historical mission of the Russian state is to destroy these very written and unwritten rules of international politics that were formed after the end of World War II. As an example, we can quote the words of Vladimir Putin from the same speech on September 30, 2022. All we hear from all sides is that the West is defending an order based on rules. Where did they come from? Who has ever seen these rules? Who agreed to them? Listen, this is just nonsense. There is nothing but outright deception, double or even triple standards. It's simply meant for fools. Russia is a great 1,000-year-old power, a civilizational state, and it will not live by such rigged fake rules. Well, what can I say? The West really can be accused of double standards and hypocrisy. For example, the US has repeatedly violated the rules of international order when it was beneficial to them. A classic example is the invasion of Iraq in 2003, carried out without a UN mandate and on very questionable grounds. But how does Putin's action, which has caused a much bloodier massacre in Ukraine than the Americans did in Iraq, contribute to building a more just world order? And how does this contribute to the transition from a unipolar to the much-praised multipolar world? On the contrary, the war has led to the consolidation of the global West, the US, and Europe. And the Kremlin strategists' calculations that, in pursuit of cheap Russian energy resources, Europe and primarily Germany and France would move out from under US influence and form some kind of alternative center of world politics with Russia, are now finally buried and cannot be revived. Moreover, Putin's attack on Ukraine has only strengthened the positions of his opponents around the world. After all, until 1922, the process of globalization was gradually leading to the weakening of the West and the strengthening of the so-called Global South. It was globalization and free access to most technologies and markets that gave non-Western countries, primarily China, a chance for accelerated development. In recent decades, real industrial production has been moving from the US and Europe to third world countries, which in practice meant a slow but steady loss of technological superiority in favor of the states where new factories, plants, and technology parks were being built. That is, once again, in favor of China, India, and other countries in Asia and Latin America. Plus, the most important incentive for their development was the availability of very cheap labor, which allowed them to flood Western markets with their products. No one could compete with Chinese goods. That's why it's not surprising that Donald Trump and his many followers are constantly calling to roll back globalization, or at least bring it under Western control. And strangely enough, the attack on Ukraine provided the perfect pretext to start this process. Today, this occurs through sanctions, energy price caps, and urging businesses to move production back to the United States and the European Union. Based on security concerns and other restrictive measures, the West is trying to reset the global economic rules in its own interests. And the Russia-Ukraine war doesn't hinder this, but actually helps, especially if this isn't the last war and another one breaks out somewhere else in the non-Western world. For example, if China gets involved in a war with Taiwan, or if India clashes with Pakistan again. And against this backdrop, the collective West remains an island of calm and stability, attracting capital from all over the world, while Russia will be left empty-handed. Theater of the absurd. In general, situations where Putin gets the exact opposite result of what he expected no longer surprise anyone. Thinking strategically several moves ahead, well, that's just not very Russian, you know? The Russian way is to strike a residential building with a missile, execute prisoners, terrorize civilians, and cause a blackout in 10-degree frost. Now that's what they call cleverness. Moscow is the best at it. And not about thinking through the long-term consequences of their actions at all. That's why the results are always so disastrous. That's exactly why I'm presenting you with the next example of justifications from the Kremlin's Goebbels. All these reasons given for why war with Ukraine was necessary are so absurd that I don't even want to discuss them. But since we've taken on these obligations, let's go ahead and get started, even if we don't feel like it. The most striking theory is that Russia was forced to start the special military operation to protect the Russian-speaking population, which was being oppressed by the damned non-Nazi government. That's pure nonsense, which led to the exact opposite result. As of February 2022, who was forbidding Ukrainian citizens from using the Russian language in everyday life? If there's something I don't know, please write it in the comments. Moreover, it is mostly the Russian-speaking population of the southeastern regions that suffers from missile and drone strikes on the rear areas. After all, the brunt of the enemy's strikes falls not on the much-hated Lviv, Ternopil or Chernivtsi, but on Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Mykolaiv and Odessa, where until recently Russian was spoken much more often than Ukrainian. Oh yes, and also Kyiv, the mother of Russian cities. What kind of person do you have to be to raise your hand against your own mother? So why be surprised when Russian strikes lead to a sharp rise in anti-Russian and nationalist sentiments in Russian-speaking regions? And even without any Ukrainization, people themselves are voluntarily switching to the Ukrainian language en masse. So who worked so hard to make this happen? That's right, the one who's now sitting in a bunker giving orders to keep bombing Ukrainian cities. Now the Kremlin's next move is genocidification, and in general there's a sharp rise in anti-Russian sentiment within Ukrainian society. Let's sort this out here. Were there anti-Russian forces in Ukraine as of the beginning of 2022? Well, yes, there were, of course, including some very radical anti-Russian forces. How else could it be? Do you think the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing hybrid war in Donbas left Ukrainian citizens indifferent? But did these forces have a decisive influence on the policies of the Ukrainian authorities? Of course not. The results of the 2014 and 2019 elections directly indicate that parties and political figures with a pro-European liberal democratic orientation dominated in Ukraine. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainians preferred parliamentary democracy to some ephemeral nationalist dictatorship. Therefore, the level of support for such clearly radical forces as Right Sector or All Ukrainian Union Svoboda has always fluctuated within a range of a few percent. And the most important question, did these anti-Russian forces pose any real threat to the Putin regime or to the very existence of the Russian state? It's laughable to even discuss. At the very least, there was no such threat that would justify starting a war on one's own initiative, and there never was. Let's move on. The next version is just some kind of nonsense. The accusation against Ukraine of trying to create nuclear and biological weapons. Here, the answer is extremely simple. In international practice, there is a clear and understandable mechanism of action. When one country suspects another country of developing weapons of mass destruction, you appeal to the IAEA. A demand to allow inspectors onto the sites and so on. For example, as was done in the case of Iran. None of this was done by Russia before the full-scale invasion began. It wasn't even planned. And what about when accusations pour out of propaganda channels that the latest biological weapons were created in secret laboratories in Ukraine, in the form of combat geese, poisoned mosquitoes, or infected bats? To begin with, it would be nice to at least catch one of those mosquitoes and show it to the international community. The main thing is to make sure it doesn't die while being transported. Laboratories near Moscow in the UN building in New York. It's pure absurdity. Goebbels would just be nervously smoking on the sidelines, and he's not the only one. A bit of conspiracy theory. I don't like theories that clearly reek of conspiracy, but in this case, I made an exception on purpose, for the sake of the full picture. Especially since some of them are extremely intriguing. Just to ignore them. Of course, the central theory is that supposedly Putin has lost his grip on reality. He severely limited his circle of contacts and decided to start a war, driven purely by personal motives, like getting closure, making history, becoming the new Peter the Great, or simply to take revenge for being called an earthworm. A lot has been said and written about the psychological health of the Moscow dictator in recent years. And to briefly summarize their diagnoses, Putin is not insane in the clinical sense of the word. Yes, he lives in a world he invented himself. In a kind of informational bubble, in a bunker in short. But inside this bunker he acts absolutely rationally from his own point of view. If there are Banderites sitting in Kiev, then they need to be replaced with normal people like Medvedchuk. If the population of Ukraine doesn't want to be liberated, then we'll do everything to expel or destroy them. If Ukrainians resist, then we'll keep rubbing them out in the outhouse. That's the typical logic of all dictators. And by the way, madness of this kind in no way frees one from responsibility for the decisions made and actions taken. However, I doubt it. That Putin's case will ever reach a real trial, maybe only a purely symbolic one. Most likely he'll share the fate of Adolf Aloisovich or Soso Djugashvili. Propagandists also often say that the West deliberately provoked Putin into war using Ukraine. The 2021 Crimea platform is mentioned as one of these provocations, and joint military exercises with NATO countries, and insulting rhetoric towards Putin. In other words, according to this version, the West was deliberately poking the bear in its den with a stick and encouraging Ukraine to do the same. It should be said here that the real threat from all these provocations was to the Russian bear. Was about the same as from a mild earthquake on one of the planets in the Alpha Centauri constellation. In other words, none at all. And they certainly didn't provide grounds for a military response. We could talk about real provocation of Russia if Ukraine had launched an offensive on Donbas or Crimea. But that didn't happen. By the way, it's quite common to hear the claim that the West could have prevented the war, the threat of which it was well aware of. If it had agreed to the demands of Putin's ultimatum to create a new European security system with a ban on Ukraine joining NATO, and in general, on the expansion of the alliance to the east, but the West didn't do that, thus, according to this version, provoking Russia into war. We've already talked about the NATO factor and how much of a real threat it was to Russia. Now I'll point out that based on the US reaction to Russia's ultimatum, Moscow could have come to a conclusion that Washington does not see the war in Ukraine as a threat to itself that would require some concessions and compromises with Putin to prevent, but rather as a unique opportunity to weaken Russia as much as possible while not getting directly involved in a war with it. And if the Russian authorities had come to such a conclusion, that alone would have been an argument not to start any war and to leave everything as it is, so as not to fall into a trap yourself. But this theory seems to me the most interesting of all, and it's far from absurd. Allegedly, there was a real conspiracy in Putin's inner circle, aimed to provoke him into starting the war by giving the Kremlin false information about the Ukrainian armed forces and Ukraine's readiness to resist. The conspirators' motives reportedly vary, from working for Western intelligence to seeking to replace the Kremlin leader. Naturally, this raises questions. How did a former KGB lieutenant colonel allow a conspiracy against himself? Such a kind, beloved leader. Didn't the KGB higher school teach him better? To always suspect those around you in everything. To be wary of potential betrayal. To nip any rot in the bud. Suspicious, just like Stalin. In 1937, he tore apart everyone he could, just to get rid of the nagging thought that someone wanted to overthrow him. Strange, then. Why didn't the Führer in our time take this path? That could have been the end of it, but some facts suggest that the struggle among the so-called Kremlin factions still exists. At least the infamous so-called Prigozhin mutiny is evidence of this. It wouldn't have happened at all if he didn't have cover at the very top. And as for the fact that in the aging Tsar's inner circle there are younger and more ambitious boyars who want to take the throne, there's no need to prove it. Especially when the little Tsar has been ruling for a quarter of a century already, and everyone is pretty tired of him. Others want to take the reins themselves. I think this promising topic could be discussed in a separate video.
Что остается в сухом остатке?
If we use Sherlock Holmes's method and eliminate all impossible options, only one remains. An imperial war of conquest. That's what Putin himself calls it. A war for the lands of historical Russia. That is, the expansion of former Moscow's territory by conquering neighboring lands, followed by the expulsion or enslavement of the local population. All the great Moscow princes acted this way, Tsars, emperors, all Russian general secretaries, and now the president has joined in too. It's banal, but there are simply no other options left. And most importantly, until February 2022, Putin planned to preserve Ukraine, or at least most of it anyway, as a puppet quasi-state with all the formal signs of sovereignty and with people like Medvedchuk and Murayev at the helm, basically a bigger version of Belarus. But now he's gone much further, and he is now seeking to completely destroy Ukrainian statehood, followed by the elimination of Ukrainian identity through repression, deportations, and assimilation. This is something Russia is very good at doing. If you don't believe it, just look at what happened to the occupied territories. After all, Moscow could have created its own version of the right Ukraine there. But no, it chose a completely different path, the path of direct annexation, and the incorporation of the captured regions into its own territory as subjects of the Federation. No more puppets or backroom deals with pro-Russian elites, only direct rule, and the suppression of any deviation from the party line.
Партии.
And finally, Putin sincerely believes that Ukraine was created by Lenin. So his historical task is to correct this historical mistake, not to allow even a simulacrum of Ukraine to exist. And then there will be the Dnipropetrovsk region of the Russian Federation, the Vinnytsia region of the Russian Federation, the Lviv region of the Russian Federation, and so on. This is worth remembering. Putin will never again allow the mistakes of the Bolsheviks, so use only reliable sources of information. Don't fall for propaganda tricks, and subscribe to our channel. Big thanks to all channel sponsors for your support. And to all viewers for watching till the end. Goodbye, everyone.